بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. We start in the name of Allah, the Lord of Mercy, the Giver of Mercy, and all praise is due to Allah, the Lord of all beings, and peace and salutations on our Prophet Muhammad and his family and his companions, and all those who follow them in righteousness until the day of reckoning. Take two. So audio is working now. This session is Ijtihad and Tajdid according to Imam Suyuti. So we're going to be covering very briefly and also the historical nature of Imam Suyuti's works on Ijtihad, and also which are three works, and his single work on Tajdid. Now Imam Suyuti, he's from the 8th century, as you can see over here. He died in the year 911, and so his book on Ijtihad and also the historical backdrop does give you some insight regarding the nature of Ijtihad and the perception of Ijtihad and the attitude towards Ijtihad in his time, and also Imam Suyuti's understanding of Ijtihad itself. And people tend to have, with respect to Ijtihad, they tend to have certain assumptions regarding how Ijtihad was approached classically, and some very often those assumptions aren't entirely accurate. And so there's a large history that we have of law, of engagement with law, engagement with fiqh, from even the beginning of the madhabs. Let's just assume it's from the beginning of the madhabs, even though we can situate history right from the time of the companions. And that's a very long history. It's over 1,000 years, and so it's very difficult to really have a comprehensive understanding of the entire period and the attitudes unless you've engaged in some significant study. So with respect to the 9th century in particular, here's Imam Suyuti. So before we get into Imam Suyuti's books on Ijtihad and Tajdid, as we mentioned, he's got 3 books on Ijtihad and 1 on Tajdid. Let's get into some background regarding Imam Suyuti himself, the author, because this background will also give you some insight with respect to the topics that we'll cover later. So, firstly, Imam Suyuti was born in the year 849. So the 9th century, and his father, he passed away in the year 855, which means that Imam Suyuti was an orphan at approximately 5 years of age. So Imam Suyuti was an orphan. His father was a learned person, so he would study among scholars, and one of the famous scholars that he studied under was Ibn Hajar. And if you see Suyuti in his works, he respects Ibn Hajar quite a bit. And Ibn Hajar wasn't alive when, at the time of Suyuti, especially when he was writing later. And so, but he refers to him with terms like Shaykhul Islam or Al-Hafiz Ibn Hajar. So he had respect for Ibn Hajar. And his father died at a significantly young age. Now, Imam Suyuti, he started teaching and issuing fatwa in his early 20s. And what that means was he was in a position of authority to some degree, or even had some leadership role quite early on. Imam Suyuti he was very outspoken. So and that indicates what his temperament might have been. He was quite outspoken. So he spoke out against things that he disagreed with, and he did that quite frequently. So he wasn't afraid of doing so. And so, that's some important backdrop. And so this is why you have a few works that he authors, some refutations of his contemporaries. Sometimes these refutations are also of his own teachers. So you find that. So he was quite outspoken. We'll get into more detail concerning that soon. Imam Suyuti, of course, because he's advocating for Ijtihad in his works, in his 3 works on Ijtihad, he naturally had an openness towards the tradition that he believed he was inheriting. And so he didn't have this rigid approach towards the tradition. And so someone might ask, what were the circumstances that might have influenced that openness and that sort of broad-mindedness towards the tradition? And so, it's in this context that it's probably worth noting that he was an orphan, and which means, and that he had no specific family religious tradition that he was sort of fixed into rigidly. And this is quite interesting because very often when people study, they have a particular template in their mind about what sort of religiosity is, or what adopting the tradition is. They've got that template in mind, or what it means to sort of have a sound approach to law. That template is already built for them when they're in traditions, or when they're brought up in a family tradition that has already created that template for them. And so if someone is brought up, and this is, you even find this among students today, and I simply state this descriptively rather than giving a value judgment, that when you have students that are brought up in a religious household, they've already got that template in their head as to what's expected of them. On the other hand, those students who aren't so much into who aren't brought up in a religious household, they don't have that a sort of fixed template in their head. And so that would, to some degree, influence their own learning and study, and also the expectation that they have of themselves. And again, I'm simply stating this descriptively rather than simply giving a value judgment. Otherwise, of course, the ultimate goal in society is to create a culture where people are learned first and foremost, and that based on their knowledge, they bring up the next generation. And so it's nice having a template. It's important to have that template, but that template should be accurate. And so you can only be accurate if people are learned. So Imam Suyuti, he was an orphan, as we mentioned, and he had no specific family tradition, religious tradition, it seems. And he was also not dedicated to simply one teacher. Like he had several teachers, and he didn't really dedicate himself exclusively to one teacher, to the degree that he solely accepts his views. And so that also created some openness in his approach. Imam Suyuti was also very confident in his learning. And naturally, someone who is very confident in their learning will just be a lot more open in the way they approach different topics. This is a natural consequence of someone's confidence in their own learning, because now the confidence is in your arguments rather than the appeal to particular authorities. And so I mentioned this from Imam Suyuti because Imam Suyuti has a number of quotes where he claims, for example, that he is the most knowledgeable person in the entire world, in subjects X, Y, and Z. He has another quote where he says where he says in the sciences of tafsir, hadith, nahu, and balagha, and the three different sub-sciences or subtopics of balagha, that the degree or the level that he reached, right? None of his teachers, let alone those sort of below them in seniority, had reached that particular level. So he has a statement like that as well. In other words, he surpassed everyone in his time in those particular sciences. That's what he argues, right? And so you have a quote like that. You also have another quote from Imam Suyuti where he says, "I believe that I'm the only living mujtahid today." And so again, that speaks to his confidence as well. That speaks to his confidence, irrespective of what one might think about those quotes. But that certainly indicates his confidence. And of course, the very fact that he's even claiming ijtihad indicates that, okay, he believes he knows what he's talking about. So that's his openness towards the tradition. And this confidence in learning, again, as we mentioned, this goes back to his claim of ijtihad and also his claim of having the most knowledge in particular sciences. As a result of what we've mentioned, Imam Suyuti did land himself in a few controversies in his time. And so part of this was based on the refutations that he had, as we mentioned before, of other contemporaries in his time. Remember, he was quite outspoken. And also his refutations against some of his teachers. And so like one of his opponents was As-Sakhawi, Imam As-Sakhawi. As-Sakhawi died in 902, and Sakhawi was Suyuti's senior in age. So I believe he was around 18 years older than him. Yet they really didn't get along, right? Didn't get along. And so Sakhawi, he has a biographical entry in one of his works of Suyuti himself, and so he mentioned some of the controversies and his refutations there. And so, as a result of that, he did, some of his contemporaries weren't too impressed. So that's, that's the first controversy. Then you had his claim of ijtihad, which also led to some controversy, right? And this is what we're focusing on. And then the third controversy was his work prohibiting logic, mantiq. Imam Suyuti, interestingly, I believe in his teens or his 20s, I believe, but during his studies, he actually did study logic. And the work he studied was the Isagogi, the popular Isagogi, as you might be aware of. He studied that. And then he mentions that later on, he came across some quotes as well by Ibn Salah and Ibn Taymiyyah after him, prohibiting mantiq. And I'm not giving an assessment of that. I don't believe it's prohibited per se. I don't believe it's prohibited per se, but although that might be a different question as with respect to the utility of mantiq itself. But anyway, that's a sort of separate discussion. But Suyuti, he did prohibit logic, mantiq, and so that also gave rise to some controversy in his time. So that's some background regarding Imam Suyuti himself. Now we get into some chronology with respect to the books that we're discussing. And this is important because it gives some chronology regarding when exactly Imam Suyuti might have claimed Ijtihad. So it's important to mention first that the initial claim of Imam Suyuti's of Imam Suyuti for Ijtihad appears to be, or it was perhaps during his 20s. Now, there's nothing explicit, and it's difficult as the editor of the work, who is Sheikh Abdullah al-Daghistani, right, is, as he mentions, that it's quite difficult to locate exactly when he claimed Ijtihad. However, there is a fatwa dated in the year 882, so this is when Suyuti is around 33 years of age, around that. So, like, you know, he gets asked in this fatwa by one of the political authorities. He says that, you know, he's asking him a question, and in this question, when he's asking the fatwa, he says that, give me the response as essentially someone who's able to perform ijtihad. So don't give me the response based on the Shafi'i school or, like, you know, the official view of the Shafi'i school. Give me the response based on what you believe is supported by the arguments. And then I believe he used, like, the fact that he's using the term ijtihad and that he's posing this fatwa to a Suyuti indicates that by this time he already gained a particular reputation of ijtihad. And so, you know, the initial claim of Ijtihad must have arisen before this. So it was perhaps during his 20s. So that was the initial claim of Ijtihad. But then you have his authorship of the three works of Ijtihad. His three works of Ijtihad. Now, this was after the initial claim. It seems as though, you know, if you were to locate this approximately, these works were authored from between the year 889 to around 900. So that was when he authored the books on Ijtihad, but his initial claim of Ijtihad was before that. Was before that, and this was also after he received some criticism regarding his the claim to Ijtihad, right? So, you know, he was part of the controversies, and then this was as a response from Suyuti regarding the criticisms others had. And then the fourth book was the book on Tajdid, and, you know, you can probably locate this after the books on Ijtihad. So it was perhaps authored after the year 900. You know, if you were to look at the claim of Tajdid as well, what do we mean by Tajdid? What do we mean by Tajdid? What we mean by Tajdid is because Suyuti, interestingly, he doesn't actually define what he means by Tajdid. And very often when people explain Tajdid or even talk about Tajdid or even Ijtihad, they don't really define what they mean by these terms. And so if you were to, you know, argue, like, give a definition of Ijtihad, and Suyuti also doesn't define Ijtihad, but you can probably extract this from the quotes that he brings. Ijtihad is to arrive at a conclusion by understanding the arguments for the conclusion. Right? So it's to that's essentially what Ijtihad is. And Tajdid, on the other hand, is to revive. What we mean by that is to revive the Islamic sciences. In other words, is to have a particular reputation as a result of the ijtihad that someone has, to basically create some significant change within the different sciences and also the educational system, perhaps. You can also perhaps include that. But there's some discussion regarding Tajdid itself, which I'd probably get into in a later slide. But, you know, his book on Tajdid was Suyuti, his initial claim, initially he hoped for Tajdid rather than claim Tajdid. So initially he didn't claim to be a mujaddid. He didn't claim to be a mujaddid. So when the criticisms came, you know, and were directed towards Suyuti regarding the claim of Tajdid, right? He responded by saying, look, I didn't claim that I was a mujaddid. I simply hoped for the station. And there's nothing wrong in hoping for the station. You see, and that's what he says. But then later on, he does claim to be the mujaddid of the time. He does claim this later on. So initially it was hope, and then later on he was acclaimed to be the Mujaddid. And so that also created some controversy with respect to, because, you know, due to the nature of the claim. There's also a similar, interestingly, there's also a similar controversy that Imam al-Laknawi landed himself into, regarding the hope of Tajdeed as well. So at the end of his book on Tuhfatul Akhyar, right, at the very end of his work on Tuhfatul Akhyar, he makes a supplication. He says, like, you know, may Allah make me amongst the Mujaddids of this century. And so, you know, and he authored this when he was around 24 years of age. And so, you know, someone looked at that and they thought that he was claiming Tajdid. And so, you know, that also gave rise to some controversy. And so, after 4 years, he authored a commentary of the work on Tuhfatul Akhyar. And then and in that commentary, in the footnote, he explains the episode of that controversy. And he explains that, look, I didn't claim Tajdid, I simply hoped for the station. And there's nothing wrong with hoping for the station. And so, you know, so that's also some history regarding Imam Laknawi himself. Imam Laknawi, he died in around 1887. So he was a lot more recent than Suyuti himself. So this is the chronology of the books by Imam Suyuti. Now we get into the nature of the claim, right, of the claim of Ijtihad by Suyuti himself. So, what is Imam Suyuti actually claiming in his 3 works? Because he's got 3 works, right, on Ijtihad. The longest work that he, from the 3 is the work الرد على من أخلد إلى الأرض وجهل أن الاجتهاد في كل عصر فرض. That, you know, that's the longest work and from the 3, and that's the most comprehensive. And so in these 3 works, what is he actually claiming? Like, what are his arguments for Ijtihad and the nature of Ijtihad? So initially, what Suyuti says, right? He says that if every century, right, or every era must contain a mujtahid. And he bases this on a number of arguments. So he says, firstly, he says that it's a communal obligation. It's a communal obligation for there to be a mujtahid in every century. That's what he argues. Again, remember the definition of Ijtihad. Ijtihad is to understand something, is to adopt an opinion based on understanding the arguments for that opinion. And so if you just understand that, then you naturally understand that, okay, yes, you need someone to be able to perform Ijtihad. In other words, understand the arguments for a particular conclusion in every era. That's a communal obligation. Otherwise is to say that you have an entire community and no one actually understands the arguments supporting a particular conclusion. So they're just following it for the sake of following it without any understanding. And so based on that, you have, based on that, it's a communal obligation, as Imam Suyuti argues, for there to be a mujtahid. I would probably more accurately phrase this as the obligation, the communal obligation of Ijtihad, and as Ibn Ashur also explains, to the extent of need, to the extent of the community's need. So it's a communal obligation for someone to be able to perform Ijtihad to the extent of the community's need. And, you know, and that means that, you know, it doesn't have to be one person performing Ijtihad in every single issue. One person can perform Ijtihad in a select number of issues, and someone else would be performing Ijtihad in a different set of issues. And to be honest, in reality, that is how Ijtihad works. In reality, that is how Ijtihad works. It's not simply one person performing Ijtihad in every single thing. That's not humanly possible. That's never occurred, right? That's never occurred. So that's not humanly possible, right? And so, you know, that's also worth understanding when you look at the nature of this communal obligation. But there's more to say about that anyway. But, you know, this is the first argument, that there's a consistent communal obligation. Then Suyuti, he quotes several scholars arguing the same thing, that it's an obligation for, you know, for the ability to perform Ijtihad is a communal obligation. He cites several scholars. I think one of the value, like, you know, it's one of the sort of points that makes Suyuti's books quite valuable, these particular books quite valuable, particularly الرد على من أخلد إلى الأرض. I think the greatest value really is in his scholarly quotes and citations. Right, so he does that. He quotes a number of authorities throughout the different centuries, and so, you know, the scholarly quotes that he brings supporting the same argument. Then the third argument that he brings is the reports indicating that a mujtahid must exist. And so, what sort of hadiths are we talking about? We're talking about, you know, the famous hadith لا تزال طائفة من أمتي ظاهرين على الحق حتى يأتي أمر الله. That, you know, there will continue to be a group of people from my nation who will be steadfast, or will be, you know, who will clearly be on the truth until the command of God comes along. And that could be, as explained by some, as being Judgment Day. And so that indicates that, you know, there's a group of people, and the fact that they're ظاهرين على الحق indicates that, you know, they're arriving at truth, and in the assumption is that they are doing so, they're arriving at truth based on understanding and some sound arguments, as that is what would fit that particular description. And so, you know, he also appeals to reports like that. Scholars classically also appeal to reports like this for the existence of a mujtahid. So the Hanabila, for example, the Hanbali school, is a famous view amongst the Hanbali school, that every era must contain a mujtahid, and then they argue it from hadiths like this. From hadiths like this. So that's the third argument. Then you have the fourth argument that Imam Suyuti mentions, which is that he lists a group of mujtahids throughout the centuries, right? Groups of mujtahids. And what does that mean? That means, what is he getting at? He's getting at the fact that mujtahids always existed. So it's not only the fact that it's a communal obligation and that these reports indicate that they exist, but also that if you're looking at things factually, or the reality of the nature of scholarship throughout the centuries, you also had mujtahids right from from the first century. And so that's where he's quoting. He quotes a number of authorities right till the 9th century, right till his era. So that's what he does. In other words, he according to Imam Suyuti, mujtahids existed at least until the 9th century. So that's that's Imam Suyuti's perspective on this first argument, that every era must contain a mujtahid. Thereafter, now he set the scene for his claim to be of being the mujtahid. So he said, okay, every era must contain a mujtahid. So okay, now he's argued that. But now the question then is, okay, so who's the mujtahid of this particular century? So that's what Imam Suyuti, that's what he's really focusing on over here. So Imam Suyuti then goes on to the claim of him being the mujtahid. So the way he does that in two ways. He highlights the conditions of ijtihad. So he highlights the conditions of ijtihad, ultimately indicating that, look, I possess these conditions. I fulfill the criteria. That's what he's arguing. And then after that, he also indicates his expertise through his authorship of several works in different sciences. So this is where he says, for example, and this is also going back to his confidence in his learning, where he says that, I've authored works on grammar that no one in the world has authored. Like, there's no one in the world currently that's authored these works like me. And he's, and he has, and he also says, similar things about hadith. He says that basically I'm the most knowledgeable in hadith currently, from all people living on the earth today. And, and he has quotes similar to that. But that's basically where he's going through. He's sort of addressing these or trying to back and support his claim of being the mujtahid. Me personally, right, when I approach discussions on Ijtihad and Tajdid and Taqlid, I don't like to focus on the term mujtahid. I mentioned this as well in the Usul al-Fiqh lesson last week, right? That when I sort of presented, Ijtihad in as a concept itself and the conditions. We actually went through the conditions there and spoke more about it. But my focus on Ijtihad, my focus on this topic tends to be on Ijtihad as a term rather than the term mujtahid. And this is extremely important. This is extremely, extremely important. There's a significant difference. There's an important difference between the term mujtahid and the term Ijtihad. The term Ijtihad refers to the activity of Ijtihad. The term mujtahid refers to the person. The term mujtahid is more of a reputation, right? Is more of a reputation. And so, like, when discussing Ijtihad or when understanding Ijtihad, I make it a point to say that, look, the term mujtahid, just put it to the side for now. Focus on the term Ijtihad and what Ijtihad actually is. That'll give you a more accurate conception of the entire chapter. And so, that's a point I make. However, over here, I'm sort of, presenting this more from the perspective of Suyuti himself. Now, we have a question here as well that, Suyuti claimed Ijtihad, but what type of Ijtihad did he actually claim? And this is a point that he mentions as well, right, in his book, that he says that some people criticize me for saying that, assuming that I've claimed a particular type of ijtihad, when I haven't claimed that particular type of ijtihad, rather I've claimed a different type of ijtihad. So what does he mean? So he, Suyuti, he identifies 3 categories of ijtihad. So first he says you have the ijtihad mustaqil. This is how he categorizes it, right? Just just go with it, right? Again, we're looking at this from the perspective of Suyuti. He says first you have the mujtahid mustaqil, which is the type of ijtihad, that is absolutely independent to the degree that you don't even adopt the principles of any imam before you. So that's the first category. Then you have the mujtahid mutlaq. You have the mujtahid mutlaq, which is the ijtihad of a person arriving at conclusions independently, but he's adopting the principles of an imam in the past. And then the third is the mujtahid muqayyad, as he describes, which is someone who's similar to the mujtahid mutlaq, meaning he arrives at conclusions independently, but he's in a restricted capacity. So maybe he doesn't have knowledge of Arabic or hadith, as the examples Suyuti gives, though arguably those examples might be incidental. But anyway, he mentions these 3 categories. Now he says that the mujtahid mustaqil, according to him, doesn't exist, right? It no longer exists, and they sort of, they died out from the 4th century. But the type of ijtihad that he's claiming is the mujtahid mutlaq. It's the mujtahid mutlaq, which is someone who adopts the principles of scholars of some imam before them, and then but he's not bound by their conclusions. So that's the type of ijtihad that he believes he's adopting. So the mujtahid, the ijtihad mutlaq. And he says that his contemporaries, they sort of, they conflate some of these categories. So they conflate the mujtahid mustaqil to the mujtahid mutlaq, right? So they conflate these two. And then they also cite particular quotes from classical scholars saying that the mujtahid mustaqil doesn't exist. And so these people assume that the mujtahid mutlaq doesn't exist, right? When in reality, he's saying that, look, you've misunderstood these quotes. The mujtahid mutlaq does exist, as classical scholars argue in their quotes as well. But it's the mujtahid mustaqil that they're talking about, which is separate. This is Suyuti's conceptualization of the issue. There's certainly more to say about that, but I won't get into that. Again, we're just focusing on Suyuti himself. Accordingly, Suyuti, he nominally maintains his Shafi'i identity. So he says that, okay, he's adopting ijtihad mutlaq. So he's adopting the principles of the imam before him. But he's not bound by his conclusions, and he can disagree with the imam himself. So that's the type of ijtihad. So, but because he's adopting his principles, he's able to maintain the Shafi'i identity. And why is this important? This is important because classically, you had these endowments or awqaf. These were awqaf systems. And these awqaf were essentially centers of learning that were dedicated very often to particular madhabs. So for example, there would be a Shafi'i waqf, there would be a Hanbali waqf, a Maliki waqf, a Hanafi waqf. And so what that meant was a Shafi'i waqf, only those who were Shafi'is could teach in there. That was a condition. Could only teach in there. And there was a salary and the stipend sort of associated with teaching there. And so the question is, okay, if Suyuti, for example, is claiming to be a mujtahid, then is he able to teach in these awqaf, the Shafi'i awqaf, or not? And so he says that, look, I'm still a Shafi'i, like I'm still maintaining that Shafi'i identity even if I'm a mujtahid. And he says that similarly, even the mujtahids before, same mujtahids before, like Alayhi ibn Abd Salam and others, even like, even Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, as he also quotes Ibn al-Qayyim on this as well. He says that, look, simply becoming a mujtahid doesn't mean that this Shafi'i identity or this identity to the madhab necessarily needs to be lost. And the analogy that he gives, or Ibn al-Qayyim gives, as he quotes, as Suyuti quotes as well, is the direct students of the imams themselves. So if you look at the direct students of the imams like Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, or even like, the direct students of Imam Malik, Ibn al-Qasim, Ibn Wahhab and others, they disagreed with the imam, while people still argue that they've maintained their identity to the madhab. And so, if that's the case, so that indicates that you can still maintain the identity while disagreeing. And Ibn al-Qayyim also says that even these direct students of the imam, they're more deserving of the label or the ascription to the madhab than those that come later on that are simply following the conclusions of the imam without necessarily understanding them. So that's what Ibn al-Qayyim argues, and that's also quoted by Suyuti himself. And so as a result of this, Suyuti also explains that those mujtahids in the past, and him as well, Like when they're agreeing with the conclusions of Imam Shafi'i, that's not necessarily because they're making taqlid of Imam Shafi'i, but rather, as mujtahids, they're arriving at a conclusion by agreeing with the argument that Imam Shafi'i himself is making. That's what Suyuti himself is arguing over here. That's what Suyuti himself is arguing. So he says the agreement with Shafi'i, even with the earlier mujtahids, it's through correspondence. It's through the argument rather than the conclusion itself. Accordingly, if you look at Suyuti's practice when it comes to adopting legal opinions, you see that Imam Suyuti, for example, he adopts non-mu'tamad opinions, right? Like non-official opinions from the Shafi'i school. This is something that's listed by Suyuti himself, and something that Abdullah al-Daghistani includes in the introduction to the work itself. So so Imam Suyuti, he lists a number of opinions that he adopts that are non-mu'tamad. They're not the mu'tamad opinions of the Shafi'i school. And he also mentions some opinions that are not from the Shafi'i school itself. So he adopts views outside of the school. And he also mentions, Suyuti, he lists some opinions that he adopts that are outside the four schools itself. He mentions 2 opinions like this, right? So that's Suyuti's practice, right? So thereafter, with respect to the nature of Ijtihad, Suyuti also cites scholarly criticisms of appeal to authority, right? Scholarly criticisms, meaning he's quoting scholars in the past. These scholars, like some of these even dedicated works to this subject, appeal to authority. Meaning, and what we mean by appeal to authority is adopting a conclusion without understanding the argument and the evidence for it. So scholars are criticizing this in the past. And he mentioned some dedicated classical works on this topic, including the work of al-Muzani, the direct student of Shafi'i himself. Al-Muzani, he also mentions Ibn Hazm. Interestingly, he also mentions Ibn Hazm and his works against appeal to authority. He also mentions Ibn Abdul Bar. He also mentions Abu Shama. He also mentions Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, right, and others as well. So these are scholars that have written dedicated works against the appeal to authority. However, it's worth noting over here, and this is extremely important, this is something that a lot of people miss, that this criticism of appeal to authority is specifically directed at the learned and the scholars. It's not directed at those who haven't studied, because all they can do, as they do in any other subject, in any other topic that's not their area of expertise, is appeal to authority, just as you do in medicine. So Ibn Abdul Bar, for example, when he's criticizing the nature of the appeal to authority, he actually makes a mention that, look, all of this that I'm mentioning, I'm speaking to scholars here. Suyuti mentions the same thing. Because why? Because everyone agrees that appeal to authority, in principle, is not only accepted, but it's necessary for someone who doesn't have knowledge regarding the subject. I mean, it doesn't even make sense. It doesn't even make sense for someone to impose, independent reasoning on someone that's unable to do that, on someone who doesn't have knowledge regarding that. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. so I mean, so this is important. This is important to mention, and classical scholars themselves note this, right? Classical scholars themselves note this. There are 2 noteworthy quotes that Imam Suyuti does bring, right, regarding the nature of madhab adherence. And I thought I'd mention this because I'm sure like many won't be aware of these 2 quotes. But these 2 quotes are from classical scholars. And these are, of course, scholars from within the tradition. At least Ibn Abdus Salam, I don't think anyone would disagree that he's part of the tradition. A very respected scholar. And Abu Shama as well. No one would really disagree that he's from the tradition. These are 2 giants. These are 2 great scholars. And so in one quote, Suyuti quotes Al-Iz ibn Abdus Salam. And this is quite interesting, right? Al-Iz ibn Abdus Salam, he criticizes in this quote those scholars who basically, when presented the arguments for a particular conclusion, right, they basically dismiss it, even though the opinion that they're adopting, according to Al-Iz ibn Abdus Salam, even if it's of their Imam, as Al-Iz ibn Abdus Salam says. He says that, look, Al-Iz ibn Abdus Salam says that some people, you get these people, they're scholars, they're learned, they've done the study, but they simply appeal to the opinion of their Imam, as he says, even though the opinion doesn't have a strong argument for it. And Al-Iz ibn Abdus Salam, he's complaining about this. He's saying that, look, these people, when you present the argument right, a sound argument, right, demonstrating that this isn't a strong opinion, they would basically say that, look, I mean, perhaps he's aware of an argument that I'm not aware of. And Isa ibn Abd salam, he criticizes them by saying, look, don't you realize that, you can equally say the same thing for the opposing claim? That maybe, like, for the opposing claim, you can equally say the same thing. And so this is Ali ibn Abd salam, he's arguing this. And he says, and he also says in that quote, he says that, look, like, some of these people, they're so sort of, tied up in this appeal to authority, right, that it's very difficult to even argue with them. It's difficult to even argue with them. So Ali ibn Abd salam, he says, like, these people, basically just leave them to what they're doing. Basically, don't bother in debate, because they're not going to listen. They're not going to listen. They're just, they're not really interested in the argument that you're presenting to them. This is Ali ibn Abd salam. Then you have Abu Shama. Abu Shama is another scholar from the Shafi'i school. And in this quote, Abu Shama, he interestingly says that, when there's a scholar, again, this is specifically to a scholar. So he says, when there's a scholar, that he shouldn't basically restrict himself to one madhab in every single issue. That's what Abu Shama's argument. Again, I'm simply looking at this from the perspective of Abu Shama and also a Suyuti who's quoting Abu Shama. I'm not really giving an assessment regarding what Abu Shama himself is saying. But Abu Shama is saying that, look, when someone is engaged in law, right, like, and he understands law, again, he's learned and he's a scholar, then he shouldn't restrict himself to a madhab, but rather he should basically get himself to a level where he's able to assess arguments for what they are. This is what Abu Shama is saying. Again, I'm not giving an assessment, I'm just simply quoting these scholars who are part of the tradition. So that's Suyuti and Ijtihad in a nutshell. Now we get to Suyuti and his claim of Tajdid, because, the fourth book, we're going on to the fourth book now. So Imam Suyuti, right, initially, as we mentioned before, initially he simply hoped for Tajdid. And even in the work, the fourth work on Tajdid, even in this work, he hasn't yet claimed to be the Mujaddid. He's simply hoping for the station. And he does this by appealing to his authorship, his writings. He's like, he says, okay, I'm deserving of this, essentially, because based on what I've authored. And also because, according to him, he's the only mujtahid alive in his time. And so, interestingly, there's a funny riddle that he gives. There's a funny riddle that Imam Suyuti gives towards the end of one of his works, where he quotes a scholar giving a riddle that name to me an act of worship that when a person engages in that act of worship, he is the only person on the earth engaging in that act of worship. And so that's the riddle. And so, one of the answers is someone performing tawaf alone. That that, okay, you're the only person performing tawaf alone if no one else is there. So that's the riddle. And then the other, but anyway, I'm not really focused on that response. I'm focused on Suyuti's response. Suyuti says, in response to this riddle, he says, and Allah has also blessed me with the fact that I'm the only mujtahid alive today. So I'm also engaged in this activity of ijtihad exclusively. Again, I mean, I'm not sort of giving an assessment on that, but that's his perspective. That's his perspective. So initially he hoped for Tajdid. However, later, as we mentioned, he did claim to be the mujtahid in a later work. Regarding the nature of Tajdid, I thought I'd just mention a few things. I've mentioned a few things with respect to Tajdid and the term mujaddid. Now, there's a hadith that's often appealed to over here, which is, إن الله يبعثه على رأس كل 100 سنة من يجدد لها دينها, or wording similar to that, narrated by Abu Dawood. Now there's some discussion regarding the authenticity of this hadith. That what does the hadith mean? That Allah Most High he basically raises at the end of every 100 years someone, or those man, you can understand it both ways, someone who revives the religion. And so this particular report, this hadith, there's some discussion regarding the authenticity. But Suyuti himself, he argues that it's authentic in his work. Just as an aside, Sheikh Abdullah Judayd, he also argues that it's authentic, but there is some discussion regarding the authenticity of the hadith itself. So that's a hadith on the mujaddid. Now there's a question that arises. Now, what does tajdid actually mean? Suyuti doesn't define what tajdid means in his book, and so this is why this is a question that, okay, what does tajdid mean? So someone might say, okay, tajdid includes the activity of ijtihad, that someone performs ijtihad and he does so in a way that's quite influential, and so he revives the sciences in that way by way of his influence, right? So someone might sort of explain it like that. Another way someone might explain it is that it's ijtihad, meaning arriving at conclusions through their arguments, and basically using and understanding the principles on which rulings are built, and also rulings that are not subject to change, right? Rulings that are not subject to change. And so, you know, someone might argue that that's Tajdid, or that's the meaning of Tajdid. But in any case, you know, there's some there's a question mark there. Another question mark with respect to this hadith is also, what does Tajdid mean? Like, in what capacity is Tajdid intended in the particular hadith? So some scholars over here, like Suyuti, he seems as though he's approaching it this way. He argues that Tajdid in the hadith is Tajdid of the sort of religious sciences, the religious sciences like hadith, Quran, and tafsir, and things like this. Whereas other scholars, for example, Ibn Ashur, he might have argued this, where he says that it's in a political capacity. Because if you're looking at Tajdid as a form of influence in society, then those who have political roles, right, they are able to create the most significant impact, right? And so, like, you know, Tajdid is primarily from political authorities who are able to basically create that revival. And so, you know, there's also a question mark there. And lastly, there's also a question mark on whether the mujaddid in the hadith, if argued to be authentic, is a single person. Does it simply refer to one person, or does it refer to a group of people? And this goes back to the word man in the hadith. The word man in Arabic can refer to the one meaning referring to one person, or you can refer to those, multiple people. And so the mujaddid, right, it can be a single person, but it can also be a group of people. Other scholars argue that it's actually a group of people, because in reality, scholarship is a group effort. It's not a one-man show. It's never been a one-man show. And so, you know, so if you understand the hadith as a group, right, collective, then, you know, you're going to approach the hadith in a different way. Classically, you do have scholars, like they offer lists of mujaddids throughout the centuries. So Suyuti does the same thing. And it's quite interesting as well that many scholars, when they do this, they mention or they name scholars from their particular madhab. So, for example, Shafi'i is in their list. They list a number of Shafi'i mujaddids. Hanafis might list the Hanafis. Malikis might list Malikis. But Ibn Ashur, I believe, like he's got a work on or treatise on Tajdid as well, and this particular hadith. And in his particular list is quite, you know, it's quite diverse. If I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure he also includes az-Zamakhshari in his list, if I'm not mistaken. But you know, that indicates how diverse he's basically made it. And that's, of course, based on Zamakhshari's impact on tafsir, and particularly the linguistic aspect of tafsir, and the significant impact that his work had on later scholars in that regard. And so, you know, you do have these questions with respect to the hadith on the mujaddid and the tajdid itself. But, you know, I thought I'd just leave it with the question marks and just allow you to be to be aware of these discussions. So, you know, that's the end of Suyuti and Tajdid. However, you know, we have some final comments here. And I want to end with this. And this is a quote by Abu Ali al-Daghistani. Remember, the editor of this book is Abdullah al-Daghistani. Now, Sheikh Abdullah al-Daghistani, right, he quotes at the very end of his introduction, or towards the end anyway, he quotes his teacher, Abu Ali al-Daghistani. And and it's a very noteworthy quote as well. It's an important quote. And Sheikh Abu Ali al-Daghistani, he mentions four things, right? So he mentions first thing, the first thing he mentions is that, you know, when conceptualizing ijtihad, don't simply conceptualize it as a level of expertise, but also look at it from the perspective of a particular temperament that's connected to the activity of ijtihad. That there's a particular temperament that a person needs to have for them to engage in ijtihad. And so, you know, someone might be very intelligent, right? And he might technically be able to perform ijtihad, but he doesn't have the temperament that would basically push him to that activity. So Abu Ali al-Daghistani, he mentions that first. Then he mentions, and he has a complaint regarding, you know, some students. He says that some people, they have the temperament of ijtihad, but they don't actually have the ability to do ijtihad. And you find this a lot. You find this a lot, as Abu Ali al-Daghistani himself mentions. He says that you find this a lot today. That's a lot of people that claim ijtihad as though they know what's going on. You know, like they've got the temperament of ijtihad, which is why they sort of daring and they're bold in their activity, but they don't really have the ability to do ijtihad. And this is the state of most students, right? Majority of students, as I always say, they're not very good students. They don't put in the graft. They don't want to put in the time. They don't want to put in the effort. They don't want to do the independent reading. They don't want to put in the graft whatsoever. And then they want to sort of claim ijtihad on things. Like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, right? You see, it doesn't make, like, you know, these things require effort. These things require effort. It's never given to you on a plate. And so this is important, right? By Abu Ali al-Daghistani, complaint of students. Then he says, and this is quite noteworthy, he says that, like, he gives an assessment on the nature of Imam Suyuti's ijtihad himself, right? Imam Suyuti's ijtihad. He says that, look, you know, if you compare Imam Suyuti's ijtihad or Imam Suyuti's activity in law to those before him, like Imam al-Juwayni, like al-Izz ibn Abd salam, right? And who else does he mention? He mentioned Ghazali before him. Imam al-Haramain, he died in like 470 something. Ghazali died 505. He mentions al-Izz ibn Abd salam as well, died 606. At-Taqiyya as-Subki as well, and others. He says that, look, if you compare their approach to law and their activity to law to Imam Suyuti's activity, you'll notice that they have a far greater proficiency in their understanding of law than Imam Suyuti. Right? This is what he argues. And he says that if you look at Imam Suyuti's own ijtihad, like his examples of ijtihad that he lists, majority of them are actually tied to transmission, the nature of hadith transmission, like a naql, rather than like a juristic insight regarding the chapters, you see. And so this is the nature of Suyuti's ijtihad as Abu Ali al-Daghistani's, according to Abu Ali al-Daghistani's assessment. And this is quite noteworthy. This is quite noteworthy that, you know, and even today, like, you know, when people typically cite legal conclusions, they're citing scholars like Imam al-Haramain and scholars like Ghazali, scholars like al-Izz ibn Abd salam. These are the legends. Like, these are the legends in the field of fiqh. But you don't see it, like, you know, it's not as prominent with Suyuti's conclusions, though, of course, you know, one can still argue, one can have that analysis, like that Abu Ali al-Daghistani is arguing, while still maintaining that, okay, Suyuti still had the ability to perform ijtihad in the things that he did. Okay. And lastly, and I want to end on this as well, and this is quite important. This is like the historical aspect to Suyuti and his claim to ijtihad and the controversy that arose from his claim to ijtihad. The Abu Ali al-Daghistani says, right? He says that, look, you know, Suyuti, right? He, like, one of the reasons he landed himself into controversy was that he publicly announced his ijtihad. However, he's discussing this historically, that if he simply engaged in what he engaged in without announcing ijtihad, his contemporaries probably wouldn't have attacked him in the way that they did. And this, you know, this speaks on the nature of the actual claim of ijtihad, which is why I said before as well, right, that it's important to distinguish the term mujtahid from the term ijtihad, right, because, you know, this creates a lot of complications, right? It creates quite a few complications. And so, like, you know, someone like, and this very often, a lot of scholars, even contemporaries, they engage in ijtihad, but they won't label it ijtihad, because ijtihad is it's got a lot of baggage to it, right? People immediately assume certain things when you mention ijtihad. People immediately assume certain things when you use the term mujtahid. They already have these assumptions in their mind, and there's a lot of polemics behind these terms as well. And so, you know, so what you find amongst contemporaries is that they'll just state their opinion on certain things. They won't label it ijtihad or whatever. And to be honest, these terms aren't really that important in themselves. What's important is the substance behind these activities, right? This activity of law, which is why even the mujtahids that we all recognize from the 2nd and 3rd century, the Imams, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Shafi'i, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, all of these, may Allah be pleased with them all, and may Allah be pleased with all the other mujtahids as well that existed during that time, right? All these mujtahids, they weren't going about and saying, people, I'm a mujtahid. They're not really focused on that. They simply getting on with the activity. And if people recognize their scholarship and their authority, then they'll follow it. And if they don't, then they won't follow it. I think that's really the nature of the activity of law, you see. And so, you know, this is also worth noting when understanding the nature of Imam Suyuti and the controversies also during his time, and also his claim and announcement of Ijtihad. And with that, we end. Does anyone have any questions? All right, there's a question here. Hold up. Can qadis, judges, perform ijtihad, or is it a requirement that they stick with their school when passing judgments? This is a very good question. One of the things that you'd find, one of the things that Suyuti himself mentions, right, is that it's one of the conditions of qada, of taking on the role of ijtihad, that a person, taking on the role of the judiciary, that the judge have the ability to perform ijtihad. What they mean by that primarily, and this is argued by most scholars, the majority of scholars, and what they mean by that is that they understand what they're judging by. Like, you can't, like, it doesn't make sense. Like, think of you know, think of even secular judges today, right? Think of, like, you know, someone, like, you know, is you know, goes to a judge, right? Goes to the court, and there's a judge there, and they rule based on the law of the country. Now, when they're ruling, right, they're ruling, and the assumption is that they understand the law of the country, right? If they didn't understand the law of the country, then they're not suited to be in that particular position. Now, the fact that they understand that, you can, yeah, the technical term that someone could label that is ijtihad. Meaning that's exactly the same thing as how you describe ijtihad. So, you know, that's what we mean by it's a requirement. However, like, classically, what you did find with respect to courts, is that you did have courts that was specific to particular madhabs. And as Ibn Ashur also mentions, that, you know, one of the pros or positives, or one of the roles that having specific courts to particular madhabs is that it allows judges to rule things quickly, because people are going to be coming to them from consistently based on different issues. And so if they arriving at sort of independent conclusions in every single issue, then firstly that's going to take a lot of time, right? That's going to take a lot of time. And so, you know, you're not going to be able to go through all of these court decisions or court cases, right? And number two, like, you know, people also question the particular conclusion that you've arrived at. You see, so there's also that. And there's also a degree when it comes to court systems as well. There's also a degree of having this official sort of position, having official state legislations, in the same way that today countries have official state legislations that they apply in court. And this is one of the important roles of having official positions, or even the mu'tamad, that they can be applied in courts like, as with a sense of predictability. There's some predictability in the court system and the way that in what they rule, in what they rule. Check out, also read the paper. There's a nice paper on taqlid, on the nature of taqlid and also ijtihad, by Ahmed al-Shamsi. Ahmed al-Shamsi, he has a book. He has an article called Rethinking Taqlid in the Early Shafi'i School. Rethinking Taqlid in the Early Shafi'i School. Now, I'd recommend reading that, particularly for the quotes, right? Particularly for the quotes. So check that out. And he also has a section there where he speaks about, like, the nature of having sort of this predictability in the court system towards the very end. So, you know, I'd recommend checking that out as well. Isa. In relation to ijtihad in today's day and age, can we have many individuals exercising ijtihad in one issue and then come to a conclusion? Or is ijtihad for one individual? I'm assuming what you mean Can we have many individuals exercising ijtihad in one issue? Okay, I'm assuming what you're referring to is what's known as the divisibility of ijtihad, the Tajazzu al-Ijtihad, which is a Tajazzu al-Ijtihad is it possible? Is it possible for someone to arrive at a conclusion independently, an independent conclusion based on arguments, in a select number of issues? In a select number of issues, so like specific issues, not in every issue, but select number of issues. I discussed this in last week's Usul lesson, but the summary is, yes, that's possible. And in reality, that is what ijtihad is. It's not humanly possible to have knowledge of all things. In other words, every single person, every single human, because they don't have knowledge of all things, will perform taqlid in a number of issues. That's just the nature of humans. They do this in every single subject, in every area. Because you can't belittle knowledge, right? To assume that one person can encompass all knowledge on every single issue. It's just not humanly possible. And this is also mentioned by, for example, Shafi'i himself in a Risala. What is an academic response to those who claim and use Ibn Abidin's Rasm al-Mufti in order to suggest a person can never opine against the Imam's position? The Imam's position. For instance, Ali ibn Abdul Salam quote about the evidence being weak. The common response is simply, you haven't understood the position of the Imam, and not the Imam's position is weak. Ali ibn Abdul Salam, if you actually look at his argument, right? If you actually look at his quote, well, there's two responses to this question, and this is a very good question, right? So the first response is, if you actually look at his quote, the people that are engaged in this discussion are people who can't actually produce a sound argument for the view of the scholar that they're appealing to. So there's a particular conclusion, and they're simply quoting that conclusion, and they don't have a sound response to the argument made by the opposing scholar. It's in that particular response that basically they sort of put in the corner, and they have no other response, so they'll respond by saying, perhaps the Imam understood X, Y, and Z. And this is something that Abu Shama also criticizes. in his work on Ijtihad and Taqlid. He has very strong words on that, which I'd recommend reading. Right? Recommend reading. Why? Recommend reading just so you understand the nature of the tradition and the nature of Ijtihad. But here's the other thing as well, right? Here's the other thing. If someone can appeal to a scholar in the past, for example, saying that you must adopt the official position, so you must stick to the school or whatever, XYZ, then the other camp can do the same thing. They've got a number of authorities that they can also quote, saying the exact opposite of what that scholar is saying. You see? So I mean, you can't, the purpose of quoting a scholar is not to say that their argument itself is binding. You see, in a scholarly arena, no scholar's words is intrinsically an evidence, intrinsically an argument, right? It doesn't matter. That's in the scholarly arena. Again, specifically in the scholarly arena. I'm not talking about non-scholars over here. I've been very clear on that throughout the lessons as well, throughout the presentation as well. We're referring to scholars here, the learned, those who have put in the graft, for years. They put in the time and effort. I'm not talking about someone who's just taken a weekend course, or someone who's studied the 14-hour year and thinks he smashed it. No, I'm not talking about not talking about them, no. Right? I'm talking about people who have actually studied in this particular realm. This is how the nature of discussions. This is the nature of discussions. Can we argue that X scholar is a mujtahid in Islamic finance in today's time? Yeah, I'll mention the scholar. Can we argue that Mufti Taqi is a mujtahid in Islamic finance? Yes, you can, for sure. This, yeah. Again, but the thing is, look, right? Here's the thing. Don't I wouldn't focus too much on the terms mujtahid. Right? Don't focus too much on the terms mujtahid or even ijtihad. I wouldn't focus too much on this, right? Just look at the nature of the activity that a person is engaged in. Mufti Taqi is, he's certainly learned. and he's certainly you know, someone who knows what he's talking about. And so yes, you can describe his activity as that. You can describe his activity as that. I think, okay, someone's shared the paper, or Isa, you've shared the paper on Ahmed al-Shamsi by or Rethinking Taqlid. Okay, apologies for the long-winded question, but the debates about switching to a different position seem persistent, even at times when it means not facilitating ease for people or suggesting a decent amount of people are doing wrong by not acting strictly on one position. I don't quite understand that question. Can you rephrase that? I've also, I also haven't really gone into much detail regarding the nature of taqlid. Everything I've discussed in this presentation is primarily for, like, you know, those who are learned and who are scholars. I'm like, this entire discussion isn't directed at those who aren't learned. Like, for them, it's just like for someone who hasn't studied, or you know, who hasn't dedicated the time to study. Simply all they do is they find an authority that they trust and they follow that authority. That's it. Scholars also said classically, you know, the general public, or the non-scholar, the non-specialist, his madhab is technically the madhab of the person who is asking. So they'll actually phrase that as al-ammi la madhab la, that he technically has no madhab. His legal code essentially is the response and the answer that he's given by the authority that's provided the answer. And there's certainly a lot to say about the nature of madhab adherence and things like that, but that's a separate discussion. I don't really want to get into that. To be honest, I'll probably have to discuss that in our next lesson on usul al-fiqh this week, inshallah. How do we establish a person who is a scholar today? A person who has studied Dars Nizami and a couple of years in Ifta. Usually scholarship is in, for the non-specialists. So you've got the specialists approach and then the non-specialist. The specialist approach is someone who is learned. He quite simply looks at the nature of the activity, looks at their works, sees if this person consistently provides sound arguments on things. And then after that, he'll say, okay, you know, I recognize that this person, he's learned. So that's basically what the specialist does. But the non-specialist, who is unable to do that, he simply approaches this in the same way that he approaches his identification of authorities in medicine. Same way. So he'll look for, you know, these qara'in, as I might call it, these indicators that, okay, you know, this person, he holds you know, this particular, you know, or he studied amongst these people or whatever. Like he might just have he might have a criteria, but those criteria aren't necessarily set in stone. But you know, you know, he's got something to go by. He's got something to go by. And of course, part of that as well is also them relating to the arguments that the authority might share. So for example, and what I mean by that is, like, you know, people can understand when, like, sometimes, you know, for certain issues, they can understand, okay, yeah, this is reasonable. What he's saying there, you know, that's reasonable. Okay. And then when that happens consistently, then they say, okay, I'm not a scholar here, but, you know, I've even this person is recognizing this person's scholarship. And so, yeah, I recognize that this person is a scholar. And that's, you know, that's just a nature. It's a very organic way of sort of identifying scholars. Do you have a YouTube channel? Okay. It's shared. Isa, Jazakallah. Wanted to read. Okay, yeah, that particular lecture is actually part of the Usul al-Fiqh course. The lecture, the presentation I gave summarizing Sheikh Abdullah Juday's book on the beard. It was more like a legal case study that I had for the Usul al-Fiqh cohort. So that's part of the Usul al-Fiqh course. I think the book you're referring to is this. I mean, we summarize this and we, I think over 1.5 hours, 1 hour 50 minutes or so. But yeah, that's that presentation. So I guess there aren't any more questions. I'll leave it there, and inshallah it'll come to an end. Hope this has been beneficial. And again, I mean, this is, you know, primarily for the sort of historical focus rather than anything else. And so, وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. May our final call be all praise is due to Allah, the Lord of all beings. Assalamu alaikum.